Okay, well, I'm absolutely delighted to be introducing Dr. Christopher Tuttle for our lecture this evening. Chris is ASA's academic coordinator and does some of our fabulous social media for us as well. But far more importantly, he's an archaeologist whose research has focused on the Nabateans and Romans. His particular field of expertise is the Nabatean city of Petra, which is absolutely on my bucket list. I have not made it there yet, but I will. And Chris has carried out fieldwork there for over 20 years. He is currently, apart from the upcoming trip to Jordan, which is running in February and then repeated again in 2025, he's about to head off to Sicily to lead our program in Sicily, particularly the archaeological areas of Agrigento and Segesta and Piazza Armerina. He also leads our Turquoise Coast program along the southern coasts of Turkey and Tunisia, where he'll be leading that in 2024 as well. And we're busily putting together a wonderful new program that Chris is going to lead in 2025, for those who like to plan ahead, to Sardinia and Corsica. It's a whole new area of archaeology is about to unravel there as well. But tonight we're talking about Jordan and its intersection between East and West. So Chris, over to you.
Thank you very much, Julia. Well, welcome, people. Thank you for joining us today to talk about one of my favorite places on the planet, Jordan. And I don't know if any of you had attended last time when I talked about Turkey. I approached this lecture in kind of the same way, with a bit of a theme. And let's just start with maps, because I do love my maps. For those not 100% familiar with it, so I put Jordan here in the middle and labeled the neighboring countries around it. And then I've zoomed out here so that we can really begin to see, when I'm talking about Jordan as part of a junction in West Asia, you can see that it really is a part of this only land bridge that connects the continent of Africa to all the other continents. And that's very key throughout its entire history, the geography of where Jordan is located. So I've chosen this today to really focus on 3 or 4 specific time periods, because really the amount of history that the modern state of Jordan has witnessed through human history is just way too much to synopsize in 45 minutes. So we're going to start way back in prehistory, because I don't think a lot of people realize just how much prehistory is in Jordan. From the very emergence of our early hominin species, the Australopithecina species, 5.6 million years ago in Africa, we see really a almost steady progression starting around 2 million years ago for the various Homo species, the Homo habilis, Homo erectus, Neanderthalensis, and the sapiens, all cross this land bridge. And this map here quickly shows you that in the latest studies that have been done, especially using DNA studies, we pretty much really do believe that the majority of the models for emigration out of Africa those millions of years ago really took 2 routes. The northern route, which went across the land bridge here, so across the across the Sinai Peninsula, including Jordan and the Levant. And then there was another migration pattern that would go across this very narrow strait at the end of the Red Sea called the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, and they would end up on the Arabian Peninsula that way. But it's pretty astounding, because there's been many models over the years about how the different migrations took place. But the more evidence we've gathered over the last century, the more solid these models are really indicating that it is across the land bridge and onto the Arabian Peninsula is pretty much how all the migrations occurred. And just very quickly, another map. This is a density map to give people an idea of just how widespread those early migrations of the Homo subspecies went. And this is our region today that we're talking about. And you can see just how dense it is here. Bearing in mind that, when these migrations started about 2 million years ago, right up until the end of the last ice age, that this whole territory, today we see Saudi Arabia and much of the region here between Mesopotamia and including Jordan as desert. But that desertification really didn't begin until after the last ice age ended 10,000 years ago. So at the time these people, early ancestors, were coming out of Africa, they really were going through grasslands and savannas and following the herds of large animals. And we'll see a few slides coming up with some artist renderings of that. But I also want to just orient people a little bit to, this is some of the very first stone tools that we have in the evolution of the human species. These are from the Acheulean tools. They're from about 1.6 million years ago down to about 100,000 years ago. And I love this photo on the right to show you just how big these hand axes are, because it gives you an idea of how powerful our ancestors must have been. And I also use these here because Acheulean stone tools are some of the earliest material that we've ever found in Jordan. And I want to just also give you an idea of how dense the spread is within Jordan. And on the left is a map from the Paleolithic period. So here we're talking about 1 million years down to about 12,000 years ago. When we say Paleolithic, it's split into 3 divisions. You can see there on the map, upper, middle, and lower. And it really spans almost 1 million years of human evolution. And those clusters shown on the map are just that. They're clusters. There are dozens and dozens of sites. And then I promised a couple of little images here on the right of the hunter-gatherer, and the idea in the lower image here of just how lush this landscape was right up until that 12,000 BC mark. I mean, we really are talking very wet lands, very rich in wildlife, flora, and very different situation than the region is today. And this is an example from the late Paleolithic and into the early Neolithic of something what we call a desert kite. And we have found now literally hundreds of these across Jordan and northern Saudi Arabia. And this is one in the Black Desert of Jordan. And we call them desert kites because they look like kites when seen from above. But what they really are intensely complex hunting traps. So they would drive the herds of animals into the entranceway here, into this large area where people in these little nested rings around the outside would be using bows and arrows and spears and just slaughtering huge numbers of animals. And it may sound brutal because, again, we look at the desert today and we think, why would they need to kill so many? Well, we're talking really incredibly large populations in this region, all through the late Paleolithic and booming, especially in the Neolithic period. So if you ever see these in photographs or in videos, you're really looking at massive hunter portion of the hunter-gatherer lifestyle. And it's how they killed a lot of animals like gazelles, ibex, and probably even some of the megafauna. And then we quickly come down to about 200,000 years ago is when Homo sapiens, our direct ancestors, evolved in Africa. And that's this big patch of red down here. But again, I include the map because as Homo sapiens moved out into the rest of the world, they went exclusively across this land bridge. And so when we're talking about the lower Paleolithic period, beginning in the middle of the lower Paleolithic, and by the time we get to the Neolithic periods, we're definitely talking about Homo sapiens sapiens in most cases. There would be still some remnant populations of Homo erectus, and up here we still had Homo neanderthalensis and a few of the other branches, but really much of what you're going to see in Jordan in terms of preserved archaeological records we're going to be talking about Homo sapiens sapiens. And here is another map for the prehistoric period of clusters from the Neolithic period to, again, show you just how extensively they're spread out. And this map's not even up to date because new research has shown a whole new set of clusters in this portion of Jordan that have yet to make it to full publication. So it's really quite astounding. And I'll talk a bit later about how big some of these settlements actually got. This is, of course, is the period when there's the radical shift away from hunter-gatherer existence, and we begin to develop and evolve agricultural practices and domestication of animals like goats and sheep and cattle so that we can stay in one place and we don't have to roam and follow the herds and live in temporary settlements based on the migration pattern of the animals, or when the undeveloped, undomesticated crops would be growing in different places. So it's right around this time period, 10,000, 9,000 BC, when we start to see Homo sapiens settling down. And on the right-hand side, this is an example of a storage for grains from a location down here near the Dead Sea at a place called Dra. It's a not completely accurate depiction because it's unclear to me whether these are baskets or ceramics, but these granary structures are actually pre-pottery Neolithic. So we had not yet developed pottery when this settlement at Dra really got underway. But this is also the time period, as I mentioned, where we can start building settlements, permanent settlements, and we have many of them throughout Jordan. Now, on the left side here of the screen with the roundhouses, these are some of the earliest buildings that humans built. And this is a little site near Petra up on a mountain called Shekeret Masai. And I love to take people there, but unfortunately it's not very convenient when you're on a tour bus. But it's quite well preserved. And these houses would be dug about a meter, a little more than a meter, into the ground. And then the foundation of the superstructure would ring that hole in the ground. So you lived partially underground, and then the structure would build above it. And a few centuries later, during the Neolithic period, there's this evolution toward rectilinear structures and a real strong clustering. You can see in this site on the right, this drawing renders something very similar to what you see in the Native American Pueblo cultures in North America, where they're just stacked on top of each other. In some cases, there's no doors, and you had to enter down through the roof and then pass from one domicile to another inside. And that, of course, was due in large part for security and protection. This is also in the southern part of Jordan near Petra. It's a site called Baja 3, and there are 7 different Neolithic villages at the site known as Baja. Again, we can't visit them, unfortunately, because you actually need climbing equipment to go up the cliffs to get to where these villages were constructed. But one site that we can visit when we're in Jordan, and it's one of the most important Neolithic villages in all of the Middle East, and it's a site just north of Petra that's known as Beida. And it's interesting for one very particular reason, and that is it's where the transition from those round houses to rectilinear or rectangular houses began. No other site has been found yet where we have this obvious transition. And in this instance right here, you can just make out part of a circular foundation on which superimposed rectilinear structures were being built. So it's what we call a type site. And in this instance, it's a type for this particular architectural innovation. And it's a lovely little hike. So if you join me next year and come to Jordan, we will actually walk out and visit this site of Beida. But I also want to take a few minutes and talk about some of the mega sites, because this is a place way out in the northeast panhandle, if you will, of Jordan, out toward the border with Iraq and Saudi Arabia. And what you're looking at here is a distribution field of burial cairns, and they are gigantic. This one here, for example, number 93, stands probably around 5 to 6 meters tall and has a circumference that is half again. So probably in the ballpark of 9 to 11 meters. And they are burials. And off in the lower left here, you also see another one of these kites, not nearly as elaborate as the last one that we found. But this is out in today what is the Black Desert, the Basalt Desert, near some ancient volcanoes, which at the time these cairns were built would have still been savanna and grassland, slowly turning into desert. And this is not a habitation site. It's a site that is a communal ritual and burial site. And this particular image only shows about 125 documented cairns, but you can see there are more off to the side here that haven't been numbered and at the time this photo was made. The last count I know is somewhere in excess of 300. And again, people didn't live here. So what this is indicating is a degree of inter-community communication that's already taking place in the region as far back as 7,000 years before the Common Era. So we're looking at 12 to 9,000 years ago. And it's a place called Wasad Pools, and it's very difficult to visit. So again, it's not something that gets added onto tours, but should you ever get the opportunity, it's an amazing place to visit. Another of the mega sites some of you may have heard of is a place just outside the capital city of Amman known as Ain Ghazal, or the Spring of the Gazelle, is how the name translates. And this is a gigantic community, and it's settled around 10,300 BC, but at that point, the earliest structures would have still been the roundhouses. But sometime in around 9,500 BC to 8,000 BC, the rectangular houses come into play. And at its height, the settlement housed over 3,000 people. And it remained in use for over 4,000 years. It was truly a mega site. And in the history of Neolithic research throughout the Middle East, and actually including Europe even, it was for a long time the largest and only mega site known. And I'm not joking, this is right outside the capital city. Like, it's now actually in the outer burbs of the city, and unfortunately there's a massive highway that goes right through it. But parts of it are preserved, and it's been turned into a national park. But that idea of about 3,000 people living there, you've probably heard of Jericho, famous Jericho in the Jordan Valley, just to the north of the Dead Sea, which was long thought to be the first urban center at the time of the Neolithic period. And it was an urban center. But the population at Ain Ghazal was 4 to 5 times greater than was at Jericho. It was a thriving farming community. They survived on growing grains and legumes and herding some of the very earliest known domestic goats that we have found in the archaeological record for the region. And incidentally enough, the outside of these houses would have been plastered with a mud plaster, but the inside was plastered floors with an actual lime-based mortar. So one of the first times we've ever seen that in the archaeological record is here at Ain Ghazal. Now, the site is most famous for these. And these are the bizarre half-life-size Ain Ghazal statues. They were made between about 6,750 BC down to about 6,700. They've all been carbon dated, and they all fall within this about a 50 or 60 year window. And the inside of them is a woven framework of bundled reeds and grasses. And then the outside is a coating of several layers of a plaster made from a marl, a type of sedimentary soil, mixed with lime and vegetable fibers. And they were decorated with tattoos you can see painted on, and you can see some here on the legs of this figure on the left. And the eyes were done with bitumen, that is the asphalt from the Dead Sea. And there's a faint hint of green in the irises of some of their eyes, which was chemically analyzed and found to be one of these copper-based minerals, dioptase, which when ground up and mixed into some sort of probably oil, creates a pigment that was used to tint things green. Now, we don't fully understand the purpose of these statues, but we do know that they were all made in a short period of time. They all did have some particular use. because we have evidence on about 32 of them were found in 2 different burial caches. And in some cases, we can see on their feet evidence that they had been intentionally stood up. And so they clearly had some sort of engaging purpose. But whenever that purpose was finished, they were intentionally broken into many pieces and all buried into these 2 burial caches. And I've included here a picture. This center photograph is from the second cache that was found. And there were so many fragments all jumbled together and even bonded together with that plaster melting in the millennia of rain seeping into the ground. They actually ended up cutting the entire block of soil out of the ground and lifting it with cranes after strapping it all up and sealing it in more plaster. And they moved that entire block to the Smithsonian Institution museums in Washington, D.C., where it took about a decade to excavate them, separate the pieces, and reassemble them into what you can see these examples on either side. It is extraordinary effort. So if you visit Jordan, you get to see some of these, like the 2-headed one here on the right, I know is in the National Museum in Amman. The 2 on the left are actually the 2, I believe, on display at the Smithsonian. So truly an amazing find. And to this day, there's been nothing else like them found anywhere else in the world. All right, so that's our quick little foray into prehistory to show some of the important sites and the extent of the sites that evolved on this historical junction that is today the modern territory of Jordan. I'm going to jump ahead now because, like I said, I'm picking a number of time periods to run some themes. And the next theme we're going to deal with is the Torah and Bible events from the Bronze Age. So if you're familiar with the Old Testament of the Bible or the first 5 books of the Torah, I want to talk specifically about these instances because they relate to sites that we always include on the tours in Jordan so that people can see them. And the first one I want to talk about is the story of Lot. Now, there's a site at the southern end of the Dead Sea known as Der Ein Abata, which means the monastery of the spring of Abata. And it is linked to the story of Lot. Now, in books, the book of Genesis, chapters 11, 14, and 19, is where we get the story of Lot. And he was a nephew of Abram who traveled with Abram and his wife from Mesopotamian Ur to Canaan. And a whole bunch of stuff happens. But eventually, they realize that the land they have been able to gain for themselves in Canaan isn't going to support their growing families and herds. And so they decide to part ways. And Lot makes his way to the Jordan Valley, to the south end, to a site that's here called Zoara in later days. And we don't know what it was called at the time that Lot went there because we're dealing with the Bronze Age and there's no recorded history at that time. But it is very near to a site you've probably heard of called Sodom. And it's part of that story with Sodom and Gomorrah. And when Abram's God decides to punish the wicked cities of the plain, he's beseeched to save Abraham. Well, at this point, Abram's become Abraham. And he beseeches God to save his relatives. So the angels come and they talk to Lot and they say, if you leave the city right now with your family, you'll be saved, but don't look back. And that's where the famous story of Lot's wife turning into a pillar of salt because she doesn't heed the angel's warning and she looks back. And here on the far right is the statue of natural salt pillar formation, which is said to be the pillar into which Lot's wife turned. And that's something that you can still see today. But here is just a few very bad photos. It's a very hard site to get photos from. But there was a Byzantine monastery built here in the 5th century to commemorate the cave, which is inside this little door right here. And after Lot's wife becomes a pillar of salt, he and his two daughters go into that cave and manage to survive the destruction of the cities of the plain. And of course, some other things happen that I don't want to talk about, but it is said to have taken place at this location. The image on the left is from the Madaba mosaic map. And here is the town of Zoara at the southern end of the Dead Sea. And this up here actually tells us this, it's broken off, but we know it says Agios Lot. So at the time of the Madaba mosaic map being made, the identification of this site as the cave and the construction of the monastery had already taken place. And we visit this site on the Jordan tour, and it has an added bonus, two actually added bonuses if the weather permits. One is doesn't require the weather. It is a phenomenal museum called the Museum at the Lowest Point on Earth. And it really is one of the best little museums in the country. But if all things work out, then there are also much later sugar mills in the area that were built during the Mamluk period. Unfortunately, this last year we didn't get to go because the weather prevented us. The roads were too muddy to get to. So the next piece I want to tell is also from the Old Testament, and this is the story of Moses and the end of his life. Now, in ancient Moab, there's a mountain that overlooks the Canaan Valley, and that's here's the Jordan River Valley off here, and then way, way off in the distance there would be Jerusalem on the other side of that hazy mountain. This falls in the story after the Exodus, and the Israelites and Moses have been wandering in the desert for 40 years. And just as they get to this spot, it's the first point where they can look across the Jordan Valley and see the promised land that Abraham's God has promised to them. But Moses isn't allowed to enter the promised land, and I'll come back to that story a little bit later. But it is at this point where Moses dies. And it is said that somewhere under this church or in one of the caves beneath the church, you have the tomb of Moses, although it's never been found. But right in the front here, you do get a sense of a later period tomb door that you may have seen in movies about Jesus Christ's tomb, 1,500 years later than Moses. But it's a remarkable site. Now, the church that's there today, as you can see, has obviously been reconstructed and it has a modern shell. But the original church on the site was built in the late 300s. It's actually one of the earliest churches in the region. And it was identified as this place in the Bible by the mother of the Emperor Constantine when she made her pilgrimage to the Holy Land in the early 300s. And went around and talked to people and identified most of these biblical sites, including the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem and many, many others. And she came to Mount Nebo, and the story goes that in talking to the locals who had maintained the oral tradition, they identified that this was the mountain of Nebo that had been written about in the scriptures. But the church that you see today is not the original church. It was rebuilt twice prior to the modern day. It was expanded in the 5th century and then totally rebuilt in the 6th century. But what's so amazing is that when they excavated the church, they found sections of the preserved mosaic floors from all three churches. So when you go inside and you tour that church today, you're getting to look at some of the oldest mosaics in the region. And you get to see this fascinating stratigraphy of when buildings are built on top of each other through time. Another part of the same story happens before they arrive at Mount Nebo, but I didn't put them in sequence because it kind of needs to flow together into my next section. We're going to move south to Petra for another piece of the Exodus story. Here is Ein Musa, this shrine, this building here, which people don't even notice it. And when you drive in to visit Petra, which is down to my left here, most people come to Petra to see the stunning rock-cut tomb facades and the buildings that were built during the Nabatean and the Hellenistic Roman period. But I am not even going to be talking about those today because to do them justice, it would take an entire lecture on its own. So let ASA know if you would like a lecture on Petra, and I'd be extremely happy to put one together since it is one of my favorite places on the planet. But we're talking about it today in the context of the biblical story and the Exodus, again, crossing through the historical junction that was Jordan. The town today is called Wadi Musa. And it's called the Valley of Moses because of this identification of the spring inside this building. And this is supposedly the point in the Exodus story when the Israelites are all dying of thirst, and God says to Moses and his brother Aaron, talk to this rock and a spring will come forth. And rather than talk to the rock, Moses strikes it with his staff. And it cracks open and out comes a spring of fresh water, which still flows to this day, according to the legend. But it was this event that was seen as not being deferential to the instructions of God that led to both Moses and his brother Aaron being denied by God the right to go into the promised land. Now, Aaron, if you don't know the story, Aaron was Moses' older brother, and he was appointed by God to be the mouthpiece of Moses, because apparently Moses didn't feel comfortable. Some scholars even say he had a stutter. So God says to Aaron, you will speak for your brother. I will talk to your brother, Moses, and Moses will tell you what to tell to the people. And when the famous event happened on the Mount Sinai and the covenant was formed and the 10 Commandments were handed down, God also at the same time elevates Aaron to be the high priest of the Israelite religion and says, this role is for you and you alone and shall be passed down through your direct descendants. And that, of course, is still carried on today in the Jewish faith. But in the book of Numbers, we're also told that it's in the 40th year of the wandering in the desert. Now, the Israelites don't know that their suffering is coming to an end, but it is at this point that they're here, they're in the Ain Musa, the Wadi Musa area, and he ascends for meditation up onto this mountain that's just south of the ancient city of Petra, and where you can see this little dot up here. Well, this little dot is this shrine, and this is Mount Hor in the Bible. Today it's called Jebel Harun, or which means the mountain of Aaron in Arabic, and he dies here. So he doesn't get to enter the promised land, fulfilling God's decree, and instead he's buried on top of this mountain. And it became a pilgrimage destination almost immediately, but really it flourished in the Byzantine period. And a church, which is this larger foundation here, a little chapel was built above his tomb, and there's a bigger monastic complex down here on this plateau below the peak. But what you see today there is it's called a weli, and it's a shrine from the Islamic period, because we must remember that Aaron and Moses both are among the prophets that precede the final prophet, Muhammad. And so the Quran, the Islamic Quran, recognizes most of the same characters that are recognized as important people in the Old Testament and the Jewish Torah, and even the New Testament for Christianity. So Jesus is a prophet who preceded Muhammad. But this shrine here to Nebi Harun, or Prophet Harun, was built in the Mamluk period in the 13th to 16th centuries. And so there we have a couple of quick examples of things that we see in Jordan related to the Bronze Age and biblical Torah stories. I then want to move quickly on to the Roman and Byzantine period, because once again, the land that is today Jordan is very much tied to the story of Christianity. But I'm going to focus on just two quick things because time is always short in these lectures. So I want to talk about a section in Petra that most visitors, when they go, have no idea it's there. And that is the Christian hermitages. Now, this is the monastery facade. This is a facade carved by the Nabateans in the 1st century AD, and it's purely Nabatean. But we call it in Arabic Adair, the monastery. And why did it get that name when it had no indication in the name what the original purpose of the monument was? Well, the reason is that when you come up to this monument, you're coming up a set of stairs up this mountain. Now, the Valley of Petra is off here down in the distance, and you come up this mountain to the northeast of the town, and you get to this plateau where there's a bunch of other stuff going on. But this is the reason you come up to see this facade. Well, on the way up, you will pass a number of caves and a couple of built structures that are Christian hermitages. And there are Christian crosses carved on the rock and painted on the rock. And that is why the Islamic settlers, the Muslim and Arab settlers who came later to the valley, called this the monastery. Now, Christian hermits lived in caves and in some cases in constructed hermitages. This is one such hermitage in Petra, and it's very tiny. Like, I'm a short person, anybody who knows me, and I can touch the interior wall to this exterior wall without even extending my arms fully. Like, people actually, a person, possibly more, lived in this. And it's built on this ledge that is a 15 to 20 meter drop right there. And you also had to have some guts, because off here in the corner, see this little rounded section of the wall? Well, that's actually enclosing a Turkish-style toilet that drops directly down to the bottom of that ravine. So yeah, you had to have a little bit of courage there. Now, Christian hermits, why is this important? It's because a couple of things I'm going to show you here are part of a set of data that is some of the earliest Christian data for the entire region. Christian hermits first appear around 250 CE in Egypt as a result of the intense persecutions of the Christian movement by the Roman Emperor Decius. The first hermits fled into remote, harsh, and wild locations to preserve the faith so that it wouldn't be destroyed in the persecutions. This movement wasn't only practical, but it was also seen as emulating the suffering endured by Jesus himself when he went into the desert and was tempted by the devil, and those famous scenes from that story. And as a result, these hermits, although they tend to live alone in their little cave or their little cells or their little hermitages, they would be sometimes clustered together in a similar region. And that sort of clustering eventually evolved a century later into the common life communities, or the Cenobite communities that would become monasticism. Now, I tell you that whole story because here in Petra, we have some of the earliest evidence for this outside of Egypt. Somewhere between 250 CE and 313 CE, when the Edict of Milan made it okay to be Christian in the Roman Empire, there were hermits living in Petra. And this right here is the most fascinating carving in all of Petra. Even though Nabateans are my thing, this is just fascinating. And it's because of this fish right here. Do you see where my mouse is moving? We have a fish carved into the wall. Now, it's carved above a niche, and the niche and this little bracket that's carved into the wall here, and there's another little bracket down here where a lamp would have been hung or some sort of votive offerings. At the time, this cave, which was kind of a hypogeum, sort of an underground shrine during the Nabatean period. But as the Nabateans are waning in the late 3rd century AD or CE, and the Christian movement is coming into the region, clearly some of these Nabatean facilities weren't being used by the Nabateans anymore, and the hermits moved in. And they carved this fish. Now, why a fish? Well, during the persecutions, the fish was the chosen symbol to represent that they were followers of Jesus Christ, because crosses were obvious, as were several of the other symbols that were being used, which could lead them to being arrested and probably killed. So they came up with using the fish, which the Greek word for fish is ichthus, or Ixthus. And that is what we call a rebus. And so by representing the fish, they were essentially using a shorthand to say to other people, I follow the teachings of Jesus Christ, because the letters spell out a phrase. The I, Iesos, Jesus. The X is Christos, the anointed one. Theos for the TH, meaning God. Hoios, the Y, or what looks like a gamma in some scripts, is son. And the S is soter. So by making a fish, they are actually indicating the phrase, Jesus Christ, Son of God, Savior. Now, this symbol of a fish isn't necessary after the Edict of Milan in 313, and it pretty much falls out of use. So whoever carved this here did so at an earlier period. And as if that wasn't enough, okay, somebody could have just carved a fish. It didn't have to be Christian. But along came the Byzantine monks later, and they wrote that out right here in a rebus box. Iesos, Christos, Theos, Hoios, Soter. So they put the same letters that spells the word for fish right in this box. They painted a red cross, and most fascinating of all, they painted a red nail to symbolize the crucifixion into the head of the fish. Really, truly one of the most fascinating carvings in all of Jordan. And if we travel to Petra and the weather permits, I can show this to some of you because it's off the beaten path. Now, I want to very quickly go through a couple of things about the Crusaders, which is the next period where the region really played a major junction in history. And we have 3 Crusader castles in Jordan that one can visit. Kerak being the most famous, Montreal in the south, and even further south, close to Petra, is a small one known as Vox Moes, or today it's called Wera. There are 2 other castles that's debated as to whether or not they're Crusader. One is in Aqaba, the fort in Aqaba, and one on Pharaoh's Island, which that island now is actually in Egypt. One or the other of those may be a missing Crusader castle that we know is mentioned in various literature, both European and Islamic, called Heli, but we don't know where it was. So just a quick overview here about the territories. On my left is an image showing where the Crusaders set up their territories after they came in the end of the 11th and throughout the 12th and 13th centuries. This is the area they controlled, and the Kingdom of Jerusalem was set up here following the capture of Jerusalem in the year 1099. Now, along this red line here, the border of the Kingdom of Jerusalem is where these castles and forts were built. Along on this side, I have another map showing when Salah ad-Din of the Ayyubid Muslim Caliph, or founder later of the Ayyubid Caliphate, at the time it was still under the Fatimid Caliphate, but after he kicks out the Crusaders, he eventually gains control of his family and becomes the new caliphate. This is where they came. And again, through Jordan. And along this line right here is where these castles were. So the Crusaders were kicked out of this region by 1089. Now, this is Kerak. It's in the north. It's in ancient Moab. This fell fairly early to the forces of Salah ad-Din. And here's the castle off to the left, and the modern town is here. And we visit this. It's a huge structure, and it's quite fascinating. Then this is Shobak, or Montreal. This is about 20 kilometers north of Petra along that line, and it was the last of the Crusader castles built in Jordan to fall to Salah ad-Din, and that was in the year 1189. Apologies. This, we don't know when it fell, but we know it fell before Montreal. This is a smaller little castle just outside Petra. Like when you walk into the Petra gate of the modern archaeological park, you can look up to the right and you can see the remnants of this Crusader castle. And at the time it was Vox Mois, I'm not quite sure how to say that in French, but today we call it Ouer. And just to give you an idea of how close it is this is the Crown Plaza Hotel right here, which is at the entrance to the park. Then there are, like I mentioned, two more possible Crusader forts, although to date we have no direct evidence that this is true. One is in Aqaba at the south where we visit, and I believe some of the people who traveled with me this past March went to visit it, and it's hypothesized that it might be the missing castle of Halim, or this one on the island, Pharaoh's Island, also known as Coral Island, which is today on the Egyptian side of the Red Sea. But you can see there's this massive structure here. But it is, again, very much debated whether it was built by the Crusaders or fully built by the Ayyubid Caliphate. So that's just a very quick overview of some of the Crusader period stuff that we can visit when we go to Jordan, and linked to, again, this concept of like, first the Crusaders come down across the Mediterranean into the Levant and then into Jordan, or down through Turkey and Syria on this land bridge to the area. And the Ayyubids come out of Egypt across the Sinai and onto this land bridge. It's the same story all throughout history. The final example I want to talk about is the actual expansion of Islam in the 7th century. And in this map, we can see that here, of course, is Mecca and Medina. And all the parts in red are things that the early Islamic armies under Muhammad himself had already conquered before his death in 632. But very quickly after his death, the first of the new caliphs, a man named Abu Bakr, the first of what we call the Rashidun caliphs, expanded exponentially outward. And everything in orange is where they expanded and conquered within like the first 4 years after Muhammad's death. But I'm not going to tell you the whole history of the Islamic Revolution, but I'm, again, interested in this area to the east of Jerusalem. You know, here we are, this is Jordan, and there's Damascus and Syria there, because one of the most pivotal events in the history of the region happened in 636. Now, this map shows the extent of the Byzantine Empire between 324 and 1453. And this lighter pink area right here, all the way up to Georgia in the Caucasus, all the way down through Egypt, and all the way actually down into the Saudi Peninsula, and all the way across North Africa. This was actually, in 636, still under control of the Byzantine Empire. And the emperor at the time was Emperor Heraclius. So we're going to zoom in here to this area, north of Jerusalem, right on today the modern Syria-Jordan border, is the Yarmouk River. And in 636, the forces of the Rashidun Caliph, Abu Bakr, who actually, died in 634. So the second caliph was Omar, and Omar is famous for building the big mosque in Damascus and the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem and the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem. These were all built by the second Rashidun Caliph of the Islamic period. But under the general named Khalid ibn al-Walid, he met the Byzantine army forces here at a battle at the Yarmouk River. Now, the Byzantine army was 2-to-1 greater than the forces of Caliph Omar. But nonetheless, Khalid ibn al-Walid was such a skillful and strategist and general that he defeated during a 6-day battle the forces of the Byzantine Empire, thus ending forever their control over anything to do in the Middle East or West Asia. At that point, the Byzantine Empire basically retracts up to, they did manage to keep a little bit of the coast of what is today Syria, but that's it. Other than that, they lost everything else, including, most importantly, control of Jerusalem. And that was in the Battle of 636. This image here, by the way, is just a fascinating little painting that I found. This dates to the 14th century. It was done by some unknown Catalan artist, and it is depicting the battle at the Yarmouk River. Okay, so following that battle, when now the forces of Islam completely control the whole region, from North Africa all the way up through eventually to Mesopotamia and well up into the southern Caucasus, it was all part of a region, province they called Bilad al-Sham. And it included, the basic parts that it included were the modern states of Libya, Syria, Palestine, Israel, and Jordan. And in Jordan part of it, they built at least 9 different palaces and fortified castles throughout what is today modern Jordan. We visit, I think, 4 of them on the Jordan tours, possibly a 5th sometimes. So to end my lecture this evening, I want to feature one of them, and it's a little pleasure palace built out in today the middle of nowhere desert called Qusay Amra. And it was commissioned by one of the sons of the caliph at the time, Walid II, and his name was, the son was Walid ibn Yazid. And somewhere between 723 and 743 CE, he commissioned the construction of this palace. And it's basically a big open audience hall and a bath complex. But we know that it was him and not his father or uncle who had been caliphs who commissioned it, although that's what we thought for literally centuries. But in the restoration work that was undertaken between 2008 and 2016, a small painted inscription was found high up on one of the walls that actually specifically says this was commissioned by Walid ibn Yazid some 20 years before he himself became caliph, for a year before he died. But this relatively small building is just staggering with its frescoes. They are some of the most interesting frescoes in the entire region. And what makes them particularly interesting is that they've been published since the 19th century. But because they were in such bad shape, and previous attempts since about 1840 to restore them and clean them and protect them, well, actually did a lot of damage. And in several of the restorations, various artists thought they knew what the images depicted, and they overpainted the images. So we literally can go to books that have been published for a century and have images that aren't accurate and whole discussions about what's being depicted that aren't accurate because the images weren't understood. But following the cleaning that was undertaken between 2008 and 2016 and the restoration, you now can see them like this example off here to the lower left and these examples here. They're beautiful. Some of them have not been cleaned as thoroughly, but again, that's part of the modern convention when doing this work. You do some of it thoroughly and you do some of it, you leave some of the rest, because what happens to things in archaeological world that we ourselves do over time is part of the continuum of what these monuments are. So you always have to find a balance. But when you visit this with us today, it is an extraordinary experience to see just how vivid these frescoes are, and that we actually know today what they're truly depicting. So I hope that I've been able to give you a glimpse of the amazing diversity of what Jordan has hosted through the entire span of human history, from the very beginning when Homo sapiens began making our way out of Africa, right up until the rise of Islam. I meant to do a little section on what happened after World War II and when the modern state of Jordan was formed in 1946 after the ending of the British Mandate following World War II, but it just was going to be too long. And I think I've already gone over my time. So thank you for listening, and I hope you've enjoyed the lecture today.
Oh, we have, Chris. Thank you so much for that. That was absolutely fascinating. I know you said you went over time, but there might be a few questions if anybody wants to unmute themselves and speak out.
You had those photos of the corrals, I suppose you'd call it, where they were hunting in the
prehistoric period.
Yes, yes. How big were they actually? You didn't say what size they were.
I intentionally did not, because in that particular photo I didn't have a scale. So I can't be 100% sure, but they are huge.
Right.
I would guess that one is somewhere in the vicinity of 75 meters across.
Yeah.
The second one that was in the image of the burial site, which there was a little kite, that one I've been to, and it's much, much smaller. That one's more like in the ballpark of probably 40 meters at max, maybe more, even like 30 meters. So it was clearly not on the scale of the first one that I showed. But we could do an entire lecture on just those, because we have found hundreds and hundreds of them now between northern Saudi Arabia and the border with Iraq.
It would be fascinating to go on this tour and to see some of that if it was possible. That would be fantastic.
Yes, well, unfortunately, it's very sad to say that a lot of the Neolithic stuff in Jordan, as well as other countries in the area, Palestine, Israel is probably the only exception, but they don't really have anything that large and spectacular either. But so many of these sites are really remote. Like that first kite I showed you, it would be probably a 10-hour drive in a four-wheel drive vehicle across the basalt desert to get to that location. And there's nothing out there. There's no place to buy food, get water, stay, anything like that. So when you go out there, you got to camp, or you've got to be willing to, or be able to do it in a single round trip. And that particular one I've never been to, because it's so far out that it just wasn't logistically possible. And it's the same thing with some of those villages I was showing you, is that Baja is an amazing site. That was the one where the almost adobe pueblo-like rectangular houses were built on the cliffs. To get up there, you really they have to rig it with climbing equipment and ladders to get up to it.
In that final slide that you show with the ceramics, because they've been cleaned, does it tell you something about the culture of the time or the way they lived?
Oh, yes. This is a great question. Okay, so we all have this idea, or have been taught, that Islam is very strict and very rigid about body image, about sex, about dancing and music. Well, that clearly wasn't the case in the 8th century when these frescoes were made for the son of the caliph, who himself would become caliph. Because I didn't show you here, but there are full, larger-than-life-size nude figures in these frescoes. It's a bathhouse. And so they're showing images of the divine courtesans from paradise, actually full nudes in the building. So we learn a lot, actually, about how perception, and we also hear this one I included on the lower left here, because it actually shows a bunch of the animals that were being hunted. Because I called this a luxury palace, but it was also a hunting lodge. And so they would go out into the remnants of these grasslands that are still out there in pockets around oases, and they would hunt. And some of them are being depicted here. So yes, that's one of the most important things about this series of frescoes, is we have nothing else like it from the 8th century in the Islamic period. There is nothing in Cairo or any of the locations in Egypt like this. There is nothing in Damascus or any locations in Syria. There's nothing in Baghdad or any locations in Iraq. This is a unique structure. Any other questions?
I meant to ask you, if this is the only site which is like that, has it caused a lot of controversy within the Muslim world.
Oh, yes. In fact, like one of the things I did not tell you is that some of the panels were clearly intentionally damaged over time. And the ones that exhibit the most damage were some of the more explicit ones. But some of the figures, such as the larger-than-life side nude females that we have, they weren't as damaged. But we think that is because later use of the site. Like when I first went to this site 25 years ago, before it was cleaned and restored, it was black inside. And since the Ottoman period, Bedouin would go in and just build fires inside these buildings, these abandoned buildings, and live in there. And they'd cook meat, and the greasy smoke would just stain layer after layer after layer. So that actually probably protected them, ironically, because they weren't chiseled out. And they weren't also removed. The other thing that's fascinating about this is there's several edicts in that first century as the Islamic caliphates were expanding outward. There were several different edicts to destroy images. And a lot of the mosaics in Christian churches, for example, in Jordan and throughout the region, any face or any living creature is discombobulated. Like all the pieces were picked out and then put back in randomly, because only Allah can make life or depict life. But interestingly enough, these paintings were commissioned somewhere between 723 and 743, which means after one of those first edicts had been made. And so is this a case of like, well, we're going to tell everybody to do this, but you're my family member. Yeah, go ahead and do whatever you want. We don't know. But it's just a fascinating structure. I really hope that you come and join us and visit, because I'll be able to point out to you what some of the specific stories are in the paintings. Many of the early prophets preceding Muhammad are depicted in these paintings. So there's this marvelous painting of Jonah and the whale on one of the walls. So
how are they protected today?
Not as well as they should be. There is a guard on the site. You're not allowed to get close to the painting. So there's wooden barriers that you have to stand behind to look at them.
Well, Chris, I have to send you a very big thank you. And thank you, everybody, for joining us.
And if I could just put a plug in, if you're not currently following ASA on Facebook and Instagram, please consider joining us there. I write a lot of short, informative posts of just giving little more factoids and little bits of information about a lot of the countries and sites that ASA Tours visit. So if you like getting a little snack with your coffee, it's filled with information, please join us on our social media feeds.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.